Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Provost. I welcome you to the Botany Lecture Theatre. I'm standing in for the Faculty Dean, Clive Williams, who unfortunately is ill today, so it was his invitation that you responded to. And I'd just like to introduce Professor John Parnell, who is going to give his inaugural lecture now. John, of course, has been a fixture in the Department of Botany and now in the School of Natural Sciences for a number of years. John first came here in 1981 after having done his first degree and his PhD at Aberdeen University. I think it was a daunting situation because he was in effect replacing David Webb in the department, and at that time David was still curator of the herbarium, and John took on that role 3 or 4 years later, and of course has been the curator ever since, and has seen that as a major development. We've seen the increasing size as we see more cabinets arrive in the department, and now there's been a major refurbishment of the herbarium during this last summer. So John was firmly fixed as the herbarium curator. Of course, he's done lots of other things in college. Over the years, he's been Dean of Graduate Studies, and he has, until very recently, been head of the School of Natural Sciences. But his area of interest, of course, is in plant systematics, and he has continued to develop that area of interest over the years here, working in Ireland and also working very actively in the tropics, and particularly in Thailand. And so he's been involved in working on the Flora of Ireland and the Flora of Thailand in particular. And it's that work that he's going to tell us about in his inaugural lecture, a title which is Plant and Animal Systematics, Unknown. So I'd ask John to give his lecture. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, colleagues, friends. It's very nice to see you all here tonight. Really nice to see you. Perhaps a wee bit invidious to pick out a couple of people from the audience, but I'm going to do so. It's the people who have come furthest I'm going to pick out. And the person who's come all the way from Thailand, I think it's really nice to see you, Pranam, here tonight. So great to see you coming from Konkan University. And really nice to see Dave Simpson, who's come here from Kew. And of course, nice to see my family. And my daughter's come from Athens. So great to see you, Catherine. Son, partner and wife come from Blessington, probably taking you longer than to get from Athens, I would expect, but anyway, really good to see you. So thanks very much for coming. I think it would also be worth just saying a little bit of an introduction as to why I'm dressed a little bit like Batman, or an extra from Batman, and to reassure anybody who's looking at this through YouTube that not all lectures in Trinity College are structured like this, and nor are all lecturers dressed like I am. This is an inaugural lecture, and therefore it has a rather different structure to the usual lectures we give. The pattern seems to be that what you do is tell the audience something about yourself, a form of autobiography, and I'm going to do that very briefly, before passing on to say something about your own work. And I'm going to put that in a very general context because the audience is quite a broad one here. When I started to think about this inaugural lecture, I thought, well, what were the influences that brought me to what is for me quite an unexpected position? I never planned my career to end up as a professor of systematic botany at all. And I tried to isolate the influences that brought me here. And the first influence that brought me here actually was this guy. And I chose this quote, and there are 3 quotes in the lecture, for a whole variety of reasons. Most of the slides in my talk have a couple of reasons for being there. I chose this because I thought it was fun, frankly. I've never seen a better introduction to a lecture than was given by this guy, Medaware, and I chose it also because he was inspirational to me. When I was growing up in Edinburgh as a small boy, didn't have television, but we did have the radio. And he gave a series of talks when I was very wee, which was on the subject of human evolution, essentially. And they were just wonderful talks. They were inspirational talks. They were clear, they were sharp, they were focused, and they actually brought my interest into the field of science, which it certainly would not have been if I had been following on from my parents. That's obviously my dad, mum, my granny, and there's me with a lot more hair than I currently have. And Dad was an artist, Mum was at home, Granny was at home as well. So there's no real scientific background there. It was also quite a small family because my father was an only child, my mum wasn't, but I never got to meet any really of her family at all for decades, and that was because her brother and those children of my brother, my uncle, were inaccessible to me. They were inaccessible because Uncle spent about 20 years of his life either in prison or under house arrest or banned by the South African government because he was thought to be such a threat to the state. Now, I mention that not to blow about him, but to actually make a point, and that is the issue of classification, because my life has been spent, my academic life has been spent in terms of classification of plants, in fact, as we'll see later on. And my young life was spent thinking, well, how are they going to classify us as a family? How did the South African government come up with a policy which dictated what race you were belonging to? Were the characters good? An interesting question. Was the whole concept just wacky? So, quite seriously, this was an influence on my early life. The influence of classification came through that experience. I'd like to say that I got interested in botany when I was a young kid. Some people do, some people don't. But when I was growing up as a young boy in Edinburgh, there wasn't much plant life where I was growing, as you can see. It's a frighteningly old slide, this, isn't it, with cobbles, gas lighting. Gosh, that really puts me in my place, doesn't it? So there wasn't much in terms of plant life, and even frankly, if there had been a lot in terms of plant life, I simply wouldn't have been interested because I was much more interested in going out on this fine warm summer's day. You can see I was dressed very well for that, to play. And that was an engagement with play that really took me into school as well. I wasn't a particularly bad and disruptive pupil, certainly not, but I wasn't very interested in a lot that was there. The one person who did interest me was the chemistry teacher, and he interested me in classification, he interested me in the periodic table, how carbon in particular worked and the molecules that it formed. And I went to university to study chemistry. He persuaded me I should go, and I went to university to study chemistry. At that time, you had to enter the university I went to as a general undergraduate student entering into a general science course, rather as you do for many of the universities in Ireland, but particularly in Trinity for TRO 71. And during that course, I had to do 4 subjects in my first year. They were always taught by the professors of botany, something that may be archaic, but I think it's a good thing to do. I think the professors should be engaged with the first year. And the most engaging teachers there, the most inspirational teachers, were the 2 professors of botany, and one of whom is still alive, and that's Charles Gimmingham. And I really would like to thank Charles Gimmingham because he interested me in this subject, which I'd never really looked at before. So that's all I'm going to tell you, and probably too much, about myself. What we're going to do this evening in the second part of the lecture, and obviously the lecture is unevenly separated into 2 distinct parts, is talk a little bit about plant and animal systematics, and talk about where the lacunae are in terms of systematics. What is systematics? Well, I've said it's concerned with classification, and it is, and a lot of my life is concerned with trying to identify and group new organisms or organisms which have already been described into categories. But it's also concerned with how those categories have arisen, that is their evolution, and it's also concerned now increasingly with their conservation. I'm also going to make this a slightly more interactive lecture than is perhaps normal for inaugural talks. I'm going to ask you questions, make sure you're still awake. Probably something I don't need to do given the hardness of the seats that you're sitting on. We're going to talk about 4 questions. How many species are there on the planet with us? That's species of organism. Why should we want to know this in the first place? And what don't we know? Hence the title of the talk. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing on Malaysia and Thailand, Malaysia being the greater Malaysian region. And we're going to talk finally, in conclusion, obviously, at conservation and economics. So how many species are there on Earth? And this is the first slide I'm going to ask a question of. Now, who shall I pick from the audience? John Graham, I'm going to pick you. What do you think this is a slide of?
It's like the desert, but it might be Mars.
Excellent, very good. And I'm not trying to embarrass anybody by this. There are no right or wrong answers, generally speaking. This is Mars, though you may notice that it's got a little bit of colonization going on already. Now, I can tell you the distance between the orbits of the Earth and Mars, which is, I looked it up, 35 million miles, more accurately than I can tell you the numbers of species living on the planet with us. So we'll have a little bit of a round now. Trevor, how many species do you think live on the planet with us?
I'd say conservative 4 million.
Okay. Alex, you looked up? Never moved. Have a guess.
3.
Okay, 3 million. Anybody else have any offers? 7. Okay.
12.5 million.
Say that again?
12.5 million.
Okay. A whole variety of offers, and any of them could be correct, because we've really not got a breeze as to the numbers of species growing on the planet with us. Some of you will have seen that there's been a recent estimate published which involves some scientists from Trinity College, and they said the number might be about 2.5 million. That's, in my view, a very low estimate. The lowest estimate prior to that, which was commonly thought about as being possibly in the right area, was Trevor's at about 4 million. I have seen estimates up to 100 million. So there's a huge range in terms of accuracy and precision in terms of the numbers of species estimated to live on the planet with us. I guess, having looked at the evidence, that there are probably about 13.5 million species living on the planet with us. Now, obviously, those species can be grouped together into different categories, and I've done that here. And the categories I just want to highlight for you are these major categories. This is the plant category here, including algae, vertebrates, animals with backbones, and insects. So just remember those. What does this graph show for us? Well, if we had identified every single species within, for example, the vertebrate category, this bar would reach from the bottom to the very top. And the same for all other bars. So what this tells you is that in the plants, we have found and identified about 40% of the species that live on the planet with us. In terms of the vertebrates, about 90%. And in terms of the insects, under 30%. So we have a very uneven knowledge of life on Earth, and it gets worse, because this is those 13.5 million species that we think might live on the planet with us, carved up into those different major groups. And that is the slice which belongs to the vertebrate group. And you can see that that slice is incredibly thin. It's less than 0.5%. So 0.5% of the species living on Earth belong to the vertebrate group. Okay, we've described and found 90% of them, but that's a very small number of species. Equally, the plants, well, they compose about 5% of the species on Earth. So we've done better there. We've described a more substantial proportion of species. What's really worrying is that that is the insect group. And that's about the proportion of those insects that we've described, about. So you could say to a first approximation that all life on Earth is insect life, and you could certainly say that we haven't described the majority of it. And I think that is absolutely appalling, frankly, and it's an indictment of both the science that we perform and of ourselves as a species. Why would we want to know? having said how many species there are, why would we want to know? Why is it important to know? What don't we know about these different categories? Well, why is it important to know, firstly? Well, I think it's important to know for a whole variety of reasons, and I'm just going to isolate a few of them on this slide, all essentially concerned with plants. And for those of you who don't know, most pharmaceuticals are not directly derived from plant or animal sources, but about 40%, some people say less, some people say more, about 40% probably are derived directly from genetic resources, plant or animal. So we have a huge resource there which we use every day. We're all wearing something, I would suspect, that is cotton, unless you're really into plastic and you're wearing a plastic shirt as well as plastic everything else. So we all use plant fibers. They're our primary source of production, and of course without them the cattle wouldn't be there and we wouldn't be there. And we certainly wouldn't be there if they didn't photosynthesize and produce oxygen for us. So plants are really important. And if that doesn't convince you that plants and biodiversity are important, maybe these two slides will. Money seems to be very important nowadays. Of course, it's always important, and that's a theme we'll return to at the end. But these are just the latest values I was able to pick out for two crops, wheat. And you can see that it is, in trade terms, an enormously important crop, incredibly important, in fact. Interesting that its value per tonne is about €250. The next one, which some of you will have an interest in, is of course much more valuable per tonne, but is still, of course, an incredibly important export crop. So plants are important to us for the things they give us, and the things they give us range across our spectrum of life. And the issues that I've raised there have begun to be debated, and there's been a whole range of documents produced under this heading here, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And I think this is a really interesting development for the science of systematics and biodiversity. And I think it's interesting because it draws in the economists of the world, and without them, I think that conservation of biodiversity is going to be very difficult. Look at what happened in terms of climate change. It was only really when the Stern report was developed and the economists became involved that people really became interested in climate change and global warming. And some of the things that you have to be aware of are really economically incredibly important in terms of the services that biodiversity and ecosystems provide. And I've picked a few examples here, one of which I think may surprise you. We've talked already about pharmaceuticals, and they're probably an incredibly important economic resource. Crop pollination is an incredibly important product of biodiversity, particularly insect biodiversity, insect species, and the value globally of the pollination of crops is probably about 153 billion euro. And some crops, of course, would not form if it weren't for pollination. But there are other more esoteric linkages to ecosystem services and biodiversity. You wouldn't think of the Panama Canal locks as, for example, being a product which was dependent on biodiversity, but it is, because the Panama Canal locks depend on the watershed being maintained. The watershed's maintenance depends on the forests being maintained, and the forests have therefore not to be clear-felled. Otherwise, the canal silts up. And that gives a value to this particular ecosystem and the biodiversity therein of 2.4 billion euro, quite a staggering amount of money. In fact, the total amount of money that's involved in ecosystem services is about $40 trillion. And that's of the same order of magnitude. It's less, but it's about the same order of magnitude as the gross national product of the world, which is, I think, about $70 or so trillion. So it is incredibly important to think about biodiversity in economic terms. But, unfortunately, 60% of the world's ecosystems are degraded, and about 20% of the world's plants are threatened with extinction. So the services that we depend on for our economic well-being are, I think, under considerable threat, and we don't know very much about the contents of those systems, the species that make them up. So we should see biodiversity loss, as has been pictured in this rather nice slide, I think, as at the core of a whole range of activities and events which will be affected as biodiversity loss increases. Water scarcity will be affected by the loss of biodiversity, for example. Extreme weather events will also be affected by that loss. And there are a whole range of other options here too. Chronic disease, for example, will be affected by the loss of biodiversity. And I think that this view of biodiversity at the center of everything is possibly going to be one of the most important things that comes out of the next 10 years or so of systematic science. There's been some very interesting work done on the differences between changing an ecosystem and leaving it as it was. And in green here you can see the bars which represent essentially the value or the amount of money you get through leaving things as they are, conserving it, and the orangey coloured bar is what happens when you convert it and the value that you get. And you can see that in all cases, over a whole range of different countries and for a whole range of different projects, you actually have more money coming in through leaving things as they are than through converting them. So I think that the economic arguments are going to be the only arguments, frankly, which will persuade governments and chief CEOs to think about conservation of biodiversity in a meaningful way. Why is all this happening? Well, we all know why it's happening, I'm sure. I thought this is rather nice. I never used to enjoy National Geographic, but this is from National Geographic, and it's quite a good graphic, I think. The boxes here represent the human impact on the planet, which is a function of the population, the affluence of the population, and the technology that's available. And you've got, therefore, three axes: population here, technology here, and affluence there. And population is obviously measured as the number of people, technology is the number of patent applications, and affluence as the GDP of the world. And you can see back at the turn of the 1900s, this was the box formed by those three characters acting together. Before I was born, not a long time before I was born, but before I was born in the 1950s, that was the box that they occupied, and this is the 2011 box. So the human impact on the planet is absolutely enormous now compared to even the very recent past in my lifetime, and is growing. So we've talked a bit about why it's important to know. Let's talk a little bit now about what we don't know, the known unknown. Well, it's possible, certainly, to find new species on the planet, and I'm just going to show you a few of those new species. This is a conifer. It's not a particularly good slide, but I haven't been to the place where they found it yet myself. This is a conifer that was found in Vietnam in 1999. An interesting example because it changed our understanding of the evolution of one of the most common hedging conifers we plant in Ireland. That's a spectacular flower. You can see here, there's a guy's hand, one of the largest slipper orchids ever found. In fact, if you do look at this ever again and Google that name, you'll find that there's a very complicated and quite unusual story associated with the finding of this name, involving court cases and a whole lot of events. You can see Dave smiling up there. I bet you're glad Q weren't involved in that. Anyway, going on though, it's still possible to find new species of mammal. There's a clouded leopard from Borneo. There's a little lemur from Madagascar. There's a little bird from India, a fish from the North Mariana Islands. And we'll end with a couple of plants. That is a pitcher plant. It's a plant which supplements its nutrition through the capture and digestion in this cup of prey, and that would be small animal prey, and in fact doesn't have to be that small in this case, because this is big enough to take in a little mouse or a rat. That there is another discovery. This is a palm in Madagascar. That I put up because it was discovered in 2008. The account was published in 2009, and it is quite remarkable as a discovery because this species is visible through Google Earth. If you go and you use Google Earth, you can actually see the individuals of this plant on the ground. So it's a massive tree. It's just huge. And yet, 2009 was when it was first described. Now, even then, we have got other species which we think we know about, but actually we don't. This is a sea lion, as you, I'm sure, recognize. And there used to be 3 subspecies or subgroupings of that sea lion. The Japanese one, the Californian one, which is the one you're most familiar with, and the one in the Galapagos, which you may have seen. I think it was in one of David Attenborough's programs. The Japanese one is extinct. It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. But molecular evidence taken from the existing populations of the California and Galapagos sea lions show that they're not actually the same species at all. They're actually 2 distinct, completely different species. And probably, though I don't know if the data has been analysed yet, the same would be said of the Japanese sea lion. So what we're saying is that even where we think we've described the biodiversity in a very well-known group, the vertebrates, and a very attractive group, the vertebrates, we really haven't done a complete job as systematists. And I think that this sums up our current position and probably our future position quite well. The Stern report, of course, as I mentioned earlier, does lead to the domination of newspaper headlines under the heading of global warming. And it's also led to the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, familiar to many of you as IPCC. The World Resources Institute report and work done in the UN suggests that, well, that may be the case now, but this is what's going to happen in the future. And last week, there was the beginning of action by international governments on this, who have set up, or will set up in 2012, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which will look at this entire question of biodiversity, its value, and so on. And I think that that is really quite a hopeful sign that governments and others will become interested in this topic. I think it's a bit sad that, frankly, at the moment, it's not clear to me that Ireland leads the debate in terms of the economics of this case. And indeed, I haven't seen anything very much from the Irish government, or indeed really from the scientific or economic community which relates to this. And I think that's a bit of a problem for us and for our place in international science. So we've covered quite a lot. How many species? Why should we want to know? And what don't we know? And I'm now going to pass on to talk a bit, in general terms, about Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia and Thailand, and some of the work that I and others have been doing there. Just to remind you of the area that we're going to be talking about, here we have Southeast Asia, Malaysia, and up here we've got, of course, where we are currently. The different colours indicate how many species are found per unit area, and though you can, if you've got good eyesight, read that from the back, let me just say to you that basically what the rather nice Scottish heather colour here indicates is that there are a heck of a lot more species here than there are here. So, for example, we have about 812 native species of plant in Ireland. Just one could debate that number, but that's about right. Whereas there are, as we'll see in a few minutes, many, many thousands of species which are native in this region, and individual countries in that region have got hugely rich floras. take you to a map just to say a little bit about this region in more detail. I'm going to look at it, and some of these names I may use. Thailand is up here. We'll be focusing on that in a few minutes. Peninsula Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and you can read the rest. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this region in fair detail, so hopefully this will help. This is an animation produced in Royal Holloway College of the drift which has occurred, the change that has occurred in the landscape and the alignment of the different fragments of Southeast Asia over the past 55 million years. Now, 55 million years is obviously an unimaginably long time span from our point of view, but not from the point of view of systematists, who would be often dealing with time spans as long as that in terms of the development of the groups they're looking at. And the angiosperms, the flowering plants, are well established by this time. You could argue when they came into being, but at least 120 million years or so ago. So the flowering plants that I'm interested in are in this region at this time and are affected by the changes that you will see. And I want you to look at this as the animation changes, and hopefully it will when I get to it. I want you to notice this orange bit here as it moves up and comes into contact with Southeast Asia. Here's Peninsula Malaysia, we saw it before. Here's Borneo, Sumatra, Java. New Guinea isn't there, notice. Philippines and Sulawesi isn't there either, really. So I want you to watch this orange thing moving up. I'll say a little bit more about it. Watch Borneo, the bit of it that you can see here. Watch here, because you'll see something up here. And watch this island up there. So let's just hopefully run this animation. Now there's this, oops, oh bother, I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to start it again, sorry. Okay. Up there, you can see the orange segment moving in. That is in fact India moving across the Indian Ocean and smashing into the continental mass that you can see there. That formed the Himalayas. In fact, recent evidence suggests that India hit this region of the world in a much more southerly position, probably on Sumatra, and slid up towards the north. You can see here moving in New Guinea. There are some continental fragments coming in to splat themselves on the top of New Guinea. And you can see that the island that I pointed to off the coast of China has moved very far south. So this is in a region of enormous geographical change and geological change. And that change hasn't stopped. It would be a mistake to think of this as the pattern we'll see for the next few million years, because the change will continue. And a very recent animation I've seen of this suggests that more or less all of these islands come together in a great blob around Peninsula Malaya. So the whole thing keeps changing. As well as these changes in the configuration of the land that you can see, you have to remember that sea levels changed in this region dramatically as well, and they drop by many tens of meters and rise by many tens of meters. And what that has allowed is for the seafloor in this region in particular to become exposed from time to time, and that has meant that plants and animals are able to travel across this region back and forth as the seafloor is exposed. And then when the sea levels rise, they are trapped in particular areas. So this has led to a very complex and actually quite fascinating series of evolutionary events, and ones which will continue. It's a well-known region for the biologists among you because it's the region where Wallace formulated his theory of evolution, co-published, of course, with Charles Darwin. And it's a region famous for the fact that you're able to put in a series of dividing lines across the region. Wallace's line obviously reflects Wallace, but there are a whole lot of different lines which are potentially insertable there. And basically what they do, though you can debate the detail, basically what they do is they split this region into an east and a west half. The east region has a largely Australian or Australasian fauna and flora, supposedly, and the western half has an Asian and mainland Southeast Asia fauna and flora, exemplified here by this tree kangaroo, which is a marsupial, and by this elephant here, a forest elephant in Borneo. An interesting forest elephant, actually, because this could be an example of accidental conservation. The Sultan of Sulu, that's in the Philippines, or was in the Philippines, was given gifts, apparently, of elephants from Java. And he put them into his forests and let them run roost. They're now extinct in Java, but are all over the place in Borneo. And there's been some very interesting molecular data which suggests that they may, in fact, be the now extinct elephants which came from Java. When we looked at this area botanically, we found that it was very difficult indeed to use any of the lines that you could work with from the point of view of zoology. What we did was we took all of the plants that were known to be growing in the region and which had been recorded in the flora and found out what their associations were through a series of fairly esoteric statistical manipulations. And we found that essentially no one line did it. You had to use a combination of lines in order to try to delimit this area in a biogeographical sense. Lydecker's line worked okay in the east, but in the west, the best we could find was this predetermined Huxley line, and it just didn't work because the different colours on this map indicate the different associations of plants that we were able to derive. So we had to move that line to the west by quite a considerable margin. And this is interesting, well, from a number of points of view. It's interesting because quite clearly the flora of this central region is distinct from those on the other two sides. It's distinct for historical reasons, some of which we've seen through the continental drift animations. It's also distinct because the climate of this region is largely dry, whereas on the west and on the east, we've got an ever wet climate. So the climate here is different. That means that you have got this region in the middle acting as a kind of filter for plants moving to the east and those moving to the west. And a filter, of course, retains some species, and therefore this is also a region which has got quite a large number of endemic species. And that has an impact on how you go about conservation of the flora and fauna of this region. It's no use thinking about these different areas, in isolation. It is essential if you're going to conserve the flora and fauna of this region, because they go together, to think of these as three separate units, all of which need conservation activity. As you've seen, we're in Southeast Asia, and I'm just going to talk a little bit now about Thailand. A large country, about the size of France, with a population somewhere in the region of the UK. Of those, well, I'm never very sure, but maybe about 7 to 9 million in Bangkok, yeah? Next nearest big city is Chiang Mai, up here with about 1 million. So that leaves you essentially with about 50 million people who must be living in the country or in smallish towns. So it's a very rural society and quite a dispersed one, and one where the society, the people have had quite a significant impact on the countryside. When I was a wee boy, when those slides I showed at the start were relevant, most of the countryside probably was forested. 50% was probably forested in the 1950s, or more than 50%, perhaps 60%. Now it's down, and people are never terribly sure how much it's down to, but you could, if you're optimistic, say it's down to 20%, and if you're a more pessimistic guy or girl, you'd say down to 10%. So there's been a huge change in the distribution of forest in this country, now mainly, but not entirely, confined to the periphery of the country. We have a historical connection through Trinity with this region, and that's one of the reasons that I got quite interested in it. This is the old Trinity College Botanic Garden in Ballsbridge. This is EFD Kerr, and he was a medical graduate of this college who went to Thailand in the early part of the 20th century. He became a very senior member of the Thai medical services there and was widely respected for his medical work. He was also an avid plant collector, not particularly interested in the scientific aspect of it, but very interested in just collecting the material. And he was in contact continually with Henry Horatio Dixon, who was a professor here in this department for over 40 years. And he sent Dixon both some of the glass slides that he took, and we have them here, as well as a large collection of plant material. And the herbarium is very fortunate in having this collection because it's a really interesting collection to look at, and still Kerr is probably the most important plant collector who's worked in that country up until the current day. It's also, of course, a very nice country. I just thought I'd give a little bit of a nice slide, a bright slide. This is when we took a field trip to Thailand. It's amazing, isn't it, how many nice plants you can find growing on a beach in the countryside. Anyway, the Flora of Thailand I've been involved with. I think Mike mentioned that at the start, and you can see, and I just got this 2 days ago actually, this is volume 11, part 1 of the Flora, and it's still incomplete. There are probably 10 to 12,500 species, estimates vary, in Thailand. As I said before, Thailand is very rich in terms of plant species. That is the same number of plant species, native plant species, as more or less as grows in Europe. I've estimated the number of species growing in Europe as just about 13,300, so we've got almost the same flora growing in Thailand. Incredibly biodiverse. About 30% of the flora has so far entered into the Flora of Thailand accounts, which we've just seen one of, and that means that it's going to take 30 to 100 years for the thing to be completed if we continue at the rate we're going at. That's actually pretty good. The flora of the Milesian region that I was talking to you about earlier, estimates for that indicate that this upper figure here of 100 years has to be multiplied by 10, 1,000 years, in order for the flora to be completed. Something like that. It's just an astonishingly large number. So we have a problem. What is the problem with trying to work on the flora of Thailand? Well, the problem is quite simply stated. If you're working on the flora of Britain or Ireland, the United Kingdom, or Ireland, you've got an advantage because lots of people have been there before you. And what I've done is I've looked at the collections of plants that there are and taken those, added them up, and divided them by the areas of the countries concerned. So if you can imagine yourself standing in the middle of a bog in Sutherland and thinking, well, how many people have collected from this area before? How many plant specimens have come from this area? Well, it would be about 17. For every square kilometre in the United Kingdom, about 17 plant specimens have been collected. In Ireland, it's not so good. It's about just under 5 specimens per square kilometre. But that still doesn't mean that you can't work on the flora and you can't publish a quite good flora. And indeed, there is a quite good flora just about to be published. I've just set the second set of proofs off, and it's going to be a bargain for anybody who wants to buy it at about €40. So there we are. In Thailand, the problem is terrible because less than half a specimen per square kilometre. So the information that's out there available to you to try to describe the species is just tiny compared to everywhere else. And that's not unique to Thailand. It's a fact for all, I would say almost all, tropical countries. And when I started to become involved in the Flora of Thailand, this obviously was something I did think about. These are rates of collecting. That's how many collections there are per 100 square kilometres per year. And you can see here we've got Thailand, and it's got a very low rate of collecting, just a bit better than Burma. After 81, and due to the involvement of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, Konkan University, the Royal Forest Department, and I'm pleased to say ourselves, we've managed to increase that rate of collecting quite substantially, as you can see from that second figure. Nevertheless, the number of specimens we've got is still very low, and it is not that tricky, as we'll see in a second, to find new species. Another problem is that those specimens that have been collected are very unevenly collected. This map here indicates all we know about the collections of plants in Thailand on a density basis, with red indicating high density of collecting and blue indicating low density. And you can see that nearly all of the country is blue. So only very few areas of the country, up here near Chiang Mai, as I've mentioned, down here in the south, some areas near Bangkok, are relatively well collected. And it's in fact even worse than that when you start to look at some of the numbers. These are, we have a database now of about 40,000 specimens, but here we've got 90,000 odd specimens coming from that red province, Chiang Mai in the north. And the next nearest is Lampang, sorry for my pronunciation, Parnell, but with about 2,000. And everything else is below that. And some provinces, at least in this database, and still, probably have no collections recorded from them. So there are areas of the country where essentially botanists have not been, or if they have been, they haven't done very much. So we have an uneven spread of collecting, we have got a low rate of collecting, and that means that it's really tough to try to describe anything from this flora, because you may have only a single example of a new species. And how do you decide whether that's new or not when you've not got many other representatives of that particular group? So it's not impossible to find new things. I stuck this slide in because I think this is one of the nicest things that we've found so far, and quite an interesting one. Here we are in a boat travelling across what is a reservoir. Now this reservoir was formed by the flooding of a series of valleys, and therefore what you can see here are mountaintops, limestone mountaintops, and they're incredibly difficult to get to. I mean, you just wouldn't get to them, an alpinist in mind, but you wouldn't get to them if it weren't for the fact that this had been flooded. And that's a plant that we collected, and Dave was on that expedition, and which was just very odd and proved to be a genus new to science. Now, for those of you who haven't done this sort of thing, genera are really quite rare to find. I mean, it's really nice to find this. So this, in a sense, is a highlight of, so far, of my botanical exploration of Thailand, this new genus. And it is quite a remarkable genus, as we'll see in a second. I would also say that this is a department, Provost, that you should be proud of, and I'm sure you are, because we've done very well in terms of finding new genera. We've found 3 new genera in this department through 3 staff. Trevor Hodkinson had people working with him on Thailand and bamboos there, found a giant bamboo new to science, a new genus of bamboo new to science. And Daniel Kelly, working in Honduras up there, found a new genus, Hondurodendron, new to science. So it's remarkable what you can find if you have people who will go out in the field and look. Kausonkia was an interesting one, and Dave Simpson would know much more about it than me, but essentially it's in the sedge family, and this is a tree, and I suppose what you need to know is that the ends of the tree indicate a closer resemblance of, in this case, an unknown species to this Phyloscopus sorry, I can hardly read that, Deserticola. And therefore, as you go back down the tree, things become more and more distantly related. And this is the new one that we have just found, and it's in a completely isolated group, fairly far down the tree. So it's an interesting phylogenetic find where the molecular systematics have placed it at the base, or near to the base, of this pretty well known, up until then, family. And this is just a composite slide of things that we've published this year. It's actually not nearly complete. These are species that we've described, or I've described this year. So these are ones that that's one I described by myself. That's with another co-worker. This is by one of my research students involving Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. That's from another research student. And there's a whole lot more. I could go on. I'm not trying to brag about it. I'm just saying that there are a lot of different species that we have been able to find. So it's not impossible to find these species, not impossible at all. And it's really exciting when you do, because you know that you're looking at something that other people have probably never seen before. If they have, they just haven't recognized it as different. Why is this interesting? Why should we care about finding new species? And what does this tell us about plant species evolution and conservation? This, some of you will know, Zur Woolley, who has saturation coverage. He's the most read comic hero, I think, in the world, because the Sunday Post in which he was, which he is, figured, and I don't have shares in the Sunday Post, let me add, is taken by virtually every household, or used to be every household in Scotland. And of course, he's concerned here with, and he is, sometimes with quite topical issues, global warming. So we used our database to try to see what would happen to the flora of Thailand in a moderately and not severe elaboration of, I was trying to avoid the word scenario of global warming. And the red indicates here where species are lost, and the green indicates where species come in. And you can see that there are some species gains here and some species losses here. But the overwhelming majority of the country loses species. Now, I'm not saying they become extinct. Actually, very few species do become extinct. But about 400 species move. So there's an enormous movement in terms of the flora due to global warming. And that has huge impacts on how you might set up nature reserves, because, of course, if this is a moderate scenario for global warming, you have to ask yourself what would happen if things were really bad. And have you set up the nature reserves in areas which can take account of these changes which are going to occur in the distribution of plants and also animals in Thailand over time? So it's not just a question of finding something and describing it, it's a question of what you can do with those data once you've got enough. And there's an awful lot that you can do, but you need to accumulate the data first. So it's nice to go out into the field and collect plants. And one of the things that I'm going to say at the end, as you'll see, is that I think we still have to do an awful lot of it. And it's just nice to do. There's no question about it. It's fun. Okay, so we're coming towards the end. I'm going to talk a little bit now about conservation and economics, trying to pull in some of the things that I talked about at the start, and also to say a little bit about the herbarium. My second quote comes from another Scotsman. Let you read that for a second. Now, Adam Smith, when he wrote that, was thinking about water and diamonds. And obviously, diamonds at that time didn't have much use. Remember, he was writing a long time ago. But water had a lot of use and relatively little value. And to be honest, I think it's a shame that we have to get involved in questions such as that if we are to think about conservation. But as I've already said, I think that the only way that conservation is going to be effective is if questions like this are looked at and we start to look at value of the biodiversity that we've described and what that value is. Here we are, the department without the attractive scaffolding outside it, and the herbarium prior to its renovation. Inside, we've got a collection of maybe 240,000 individual sheets of plants, and that is one of the cupboards opened up. And you can see a large number of red folders in here. Those red folders are folders which are used to indicate specimens on which the original description of a new species is based. We have an awful lot of those in the herbarium. It's a very important collection, indeed internationally. We're extremely fortunate to have it. We've also got some very old specimens. This is the oldest one I've so far found, probably the oldest one I will find. It's probably from about 1722. And it's the oldest specimen collected in Ireland. And just to read you what the inscription says, it says, "This grows very plentifully upon the sandy brows below the black rock near the sea." This is Rosa pimpinella folia, a member of the rose genus, Burnet rose, and it still grows at Black Rock in Dublin. So we have a very old, very interesting collection of plants, as well as one which is being supplemented by collections that we are doing, something I'll say about, talk about in a second. We've also got some accounts from the 1860s when Harvey was the curator. Now, I want to just highlight this bit. This is for June the 7th, 1861. And perhaps you can make this out to read June the 7th, Glure, 6 days, 7 shillings and 6pence. Now, the Glure, David Webb, who Mike mentioned, said it was glue woman. The Glure was paid, essentially, not very much for sticking the plants to the sheets of paper. That's 6 days' work, and for those of you who are old enough to remember pre-decimalisation, there were 20 shillings in the pound, and therefore this is less than essentially 50 cents. 50 cents. By contrast, on the 13th of June, Harvey, my predecessor, one of them, bought 960 specimens of spruces plants, which cost £20 and 3 shillings. Now, I thought that was quite an interesting contrast when I first came across it, because it does give you a way to try to estimate both the value of the collection and the costs of accumulating it. And it is interesting because, in fact, it's consistent over time. And I found that about 30% of the average daily unskilled person's wage was enough to collect one specimen. And you can work that out from that statistic that I've just given you, look at wage rates, and you can work it out from the expeditions that we've had from Trinity College. So that's €25, 20 for each sheet. Now, this is a graph you've seen before, but somewhat changed. In this case, I've taken out the algae from the equation, from the graph, and therefore we're looking really only at the flowering plants, the ferns, and the conifers. And you can see here that we've reached about 80% of the species that exist on Earth being described in those groups. So obviously that tells you something about the algae, which I think are a very understudied group. Therefore, we can work out quite easily what the gap is here between where we are and where we would be if we had got to 100%, and it's about 70,000 species, and therefore we can multiply up quite easily, because about 1 in 120 things that we collect on our current expeditions is new to science. So the minimal cost to actually get that bar up to the 100% level is about €211 million. Well, let's say that that's just both inaccurate and imprecise, and let's just think of it as being out by an order of magnitude, and let's think that it's actually much more like 2 billion, okay? That seems a figure that we're all familiar with from the news. It's about the amount of money that BNP Paribas have in terms of Greek government debt, so I understand, and it actually is also equivalent to their quarterly annual profits. Royal Dutch Shell made that amount of money in 2011 so far on those sales, and Tesco, our favourite, made about 3 billion euro. So this is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money by the standards of commercial enterprises, and it's not a lot of money by the standards of science either. Because if you look at, for example, the cost of the Large Hadron Collider, the budget for that is about 7.2 billion, and the James Webb Space Telescope, not yet built, is about 6 billion. So it is not an unreasonable amount of money to expect or to hope that you would be able to generate to essentially categorize life on Earth for us. And I think it's important to realize just how important that categorization is, because without it, as this, my final quotation says, nothing is going to work. You can't do an experiment, you can't investigate anything unless you know what you're working on. If you don't know what you're working on, you're sunk. So without the field naturalist, without the systematic biologist, we simply will not get anything to work. So we have, I think, more questions than we have answers still. We need more data, and don't you regret the passing of President Bush? Anyway, that's it. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay, well, thanks very much for such a quite sweeping survey of the topic, John. We suggested we might have 2 or 3 questions now before we go to reception, which is laid on by Dean, who unfortunately isn't here, but it's over in the Samantha. So, are there any questions?
Don't feel you have to.
Or do you want to go to reception?
No, I won't.
Try with that.
Oh, good.
Given the time it's going to take to these species and describe them, what can we do to speed up the process? It seems to be very slow at the moment. What would you recommend are the main ways in which we can speed up?
I think there are a number of things that we could think of doing differently. For example, I took the algae out, and I think that one of the things we've not done well is we've not concentrated on the groups which have the biggest gaps. In a sense, that's because the groups that you become interested in are the ones that are most attractive. I mean, furry animals are always more attractive than plants, and plants with flowers are more attractive than minute microscopic seaweeds, because the majority of the seaweeds that aren't known are in fact only visible with a microscope. So it would be good if our educational system were developed to promote the study of those groups. I think that would be at least a start. I don't think you can do much else, and it would also be good if we were able to concentrate our activities on the areas which we now currently are most biodiverse and most understudied. Frankly, studying the flora of Europe, interesting though it is, and trying to describe species in it, interesting though that is, and though I do it and it helps my study of the Flora of Thailand, is not perhaps the best way to go about using scarce resources. And I suppose the final thing I'd say is that I think that the systems in a number of European countries in higher education are mitigated against systematics as a discipline. Now that is because systematics doesn't need a lot of funding to achieve quite a lot. And in certainly some European countries, our next door neighbour Britain, for example, the university's grant is very intimately tied both to the income that the researchers bring in and the impact of their publications, and the impact of systematics publications is really very low. So it requires a cultural shift, I think, and I think it also requires chief executives and big companies to become interested in this, because once there's seen to be an economic benefit, then the money will come in, I think. Otherwise, I'm not particularly optimistic, to be quite honest. Hi, David.
John, it's one of the problems in the future going to be that
Yes.
In other words, how, for example, do you identify new species? Is it, do you actually have a gut feeling there is something new there, or do you actually have to bring it back to the lab?
Well, sometimes you do have to bring it back, and sometimes you don't know until you've brought it back and done some quite difficult esoteric analyses. But a lot of species description now, despite the hype, which is reasonable, for the new techniques of molecular sequencing and analysis, and there's some wonderful new sequences out there, second generation sequences, which in fact are very, very high powered. Despite that, it really is still, in the majority of cases, does it look different? And therefore you've got to accumulate a really large base knowledge in your own mind, a sort of visual picture of what things look like, as well as something to refer to. So the answer to your question is, actually I think there are probably quite a lot of undescribed species in the herbarium, but there are certainly a huge amount out there in areas where people haven't yet collected. So I don't know if that sort of answers your questions actually, Dave. Does it? Okay.
I'll take one more.
Sorry, you're behind the light.
Sorry. The loss of insects is happening so fast that actually simply waiting will reduce the problem. We're not finding them as fast as they're dying out.
Yeah.
Do you get the feeling that's true of plants as well? Are we losing them as fast as we're finding them? Or actually it's the balance the other way and we're finding them faster than they're going extinct?
I think at the moment it's the latter, but of course extinction isn't a point of, in a sense is a point event, but in a sense isn't. Where we are for a number of plant species, as came through David Middleton's talk earlier today, is with the populations of those species being incredibly reduced in size, reduced to a level where essentially they're inviable and they will not continue over even tens of years. So the question is when we reach that tipping point and when we drop off the edge. And I don't think we've yet reached that tipping point, but I would suggest that we're pretty close to it for a number of tropical areas in particular, where the pressures on the landscape are absolutely enormous and where the population is growing. Quite interesting, isn't it, that population demography, human population demography, is something that has not actually entered into discourse recently. It's not something that people talk about very much. I'm not quite sure why, because essentially that's one of the issues that we should be thinking about.
Okay, I think we'll close there, but I just once again thank John for such a wide-ranging presentation. I mean, one of the things done for me is to show botany and plant biology and biology in general, the two extremes of the more traditional, what we might call old-fashioned botany, and the new molecular biology. And I think what John has shown is how this is all coming together and how we can work together to actually answer these questions that we couldn't answer in the past by using really new and very rapidly developing techniques. And I think this is a message that we need to send to the rest of the world, really, in terms of justifying the type of work that's done here. And ultimately, John has shown the economic value of doing that, which a good Scotsman will always do. So,